Okay, so to really get into this, I want you to picture something for us. It's a summer morning, the year 793 AD.
Right, a really serene, peaceful morning.
Exactly. You've got this light fog hanging over the North Sea,
Hmm.
but the sun is just starting to burn through it. It feels like it's going to be a completely normal, quiet day.
You have to remember where we are. We're on Lindisfarne, the Holy Island. It's this tiny, windswept rock just off the coast of Northumbria in England.
And it's not just any old place. This is one of the most sacred, most treasured sites in all of Christendom. It's a monastic community that had been there, in quiet contemplation for more than a century.
It was really the spiritual heart of the entire region.
Hmm.
The monks there are transcribing these incredibly valuable sacred texts, preserving knowledge from the classical world, and they're also storing the wealth of the faithful.
What kind of wealth are we talking about?
We're talking golden crosses, silver chalices, donated jewels, all of it stored with this absolute confidence that no Christian would ever, ever dare to violate such a holy sanctuary.
They felt completely safe,
Yeah.
protected by God and just by their sheer remoteness.
Uh-huh.
But on this particular morning, something on the horizon starts to change. Silhouettes start to emerge from that mist. They're strange, very sleek ships, low to the water, and they're moving with this, well, an unnatural speed.
And these weren't ships anyone there would have recognized. They were long, terrifying shapes with these high, curving prows.
Carved into the likeness of screaming dragons.
Yeah, the dragon prows. I mean, they were a terrifying sight in and of themselves. Originally, they were probably meant to ward off sea monsters,
Yeah.
spirits of the deep. But they worked just as well to strike absolute panic into the hearts of men who had never seen anything like them.
So within minutes, these ships just beach themselves right on the sand. The raiders pour out, and they are fast, they are brutal, and they are utterly pagan.
The monastery is just engulfed in flames. The monks are cut down right where they stand, trying to protect their altars. The sacred treasury, which had been accumulated over generations, is just systematically looted.
And this wasn't just a robbery, was it? This was something more.
Oh, absolutely. This was the psychological warfare of the medieval age.
Yeah.
The monks who weren't killed right away were dragged off in chains. They were destined for the slave markets.
So they were human plunder, actual tradable wealth.
Exactly. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, the dragon ships are gone. They just vanish back into the ocean mist, leaving behind nothing but fire, corpses, and this empty, violated sanctuary.
So the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, it wasn't just some brutal footnote in history. It was like a global announcement. It completely shattered the comfortable isolation of the Christian world, and it marks the violent opening act of what we now call the Viking Age.
The shockwaves were immediate and profound. There was a scholar, Alcuin, writing from Charlemagne's court, and he really captures the terror better than anyone.
What did he say?
He wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." And then he adds, "The Church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its ornaments." I mean, to them, it was thought to be impossible.
And that impossibility, how these so-called barbarians could just appear from nowhere and then vanish with such deadly efficiency, that's really what we're here to unpack today. Our mission in this deep dive is to move beyond the cartoonish myths and uncover the true identity of the Norsemen.
Yeah, because what you probably think you know about Vikings is likely distorted by, well, centuries of romanticism and just plain fiction. For example, let's just get the biggest misconception out of the way right now.
It has to be the horned helmet.
It's always the horned helmet, complete and utter fiction. We have zero, and I mean zero, archaeological evidence to support it.
So where did that image even come from then?
It's basically a 19th century invention. Romantic artists and later on set designers for Wagnerian operas. They just thought it looked dramatic and fearsome. But just think about it practically for a second.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Imagine trying to fight in close quarters with two giant cow horns on your head, just waiting to catch an opponent's sword or get snagged on a tree branch. It's completely impractical.
So we're going way past the Hollywood image today. This deep dive is about understanding the people behind that terror. Who they were, where they really came from, their revolutionary technology, their complex beliefs, and the very specific circumstances that sort of launched them onto the global stage.
We're going to trace their journey not just across Europe, but all the way from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to North America to a place they called Vinland, a full 500 years before Columbus even set sail.
But to understand the pirate and the trader and the poet and even the sophisticated lawmaker, we have to start at the very beginning.
At the source.
The harsh foundations of their Scandinavian homeland. Okay, let's unpack this then. If you just look at a map of Scandinavia, especially Norway, you realize immediately that this is a land that requires relentless resilience just to survive. The geography is absolutely defining.
It truly is. I mean, Scandinavia is not a gentle place. Norway is just dominated by these massive, mile-deep fjords. They're these long, narrow inlets carved out by ancient glaciers with towering cliffs that basically cut off access to the interior.
So you're hemmed in by the sea on one side and mountains on the other.
Exactly. And the rest of the land is just dense forests or frozen tundra. The climate just compounds this difficulty. We're talking about incredibly long, punishing winters, often lasting 8 months or even more.
And if you go far enough north, you get the polar night, weeks where the sun just doesn't rise above the horizon at all.
That kind of environment, it dictates everything about the culture that emerges from it. Survival becomes the key driver. The ability to endure, to be resourceful, and to plan far, far ahead. That really defines the Norse character, and you see this immediately when you look at their agriculture.
The land was, what's the word? Deeply stingy with its bounty.
Stingy is the perfect word. We estimate that perhaps only 3%, maybe 4 at the most, of the land in Norway was actually suitable for agriculture.
3%. That's almost nothing. How do you even build a society on that?
Well, that's the thing. You do it with extreme difficulty. You have these tiny fragmented strips of workable soil wedged between the mountains or along the sheltered inner parts of the fjords. That's it. So while they did farm, they grew hardy crops like barley, oats, and rye. It was never really enough to support a large, rapidly growing population.
And I imagine that short growing season must have created massive logistical problems every single year, especially when it came to livestock.
It created an annual crisis, a bottleneck. Keeping your livestock, your cattle, sheep, goats alive through an 8-month winter required enormous reserves of stored fodder.
Which they didn't have the land to grow.
Precisely. So because resources were so limited, many smaller farmers, and even some of the larger ones, were forced to slaughter the majority of their animals every single autumn. This wasn't just for meat, it was a survival strategy. They literally couldn't afford to feed them until the spring.
So if the land offers such a precarious existence, the people naturally had to pivot their focus. Where did their salvation and, I guess, their wealth come from?
It came from the sea. The same geography that restricts farming actually creates phenomenal conditions for marine life. The cold, oxygen-rich waters along the Norse coastline host some of the richest fishing grounds on Earth. They're just teeming with cod, herring, salmon.
So the sea transforms from being a barrier into a highway and a pantry.
Absolutely. The sea was their greatest asset. They mastered fishing, of course, but they also mastered the hunt for marine mammals. Seals, walruses, whales.
Yeah.
These were crucial sources of blubber for oil, which is essential for heat and light, and, critically, walrus ivory.
Which became a huge trade good, right?
An incredibly high-value luxury good when it was exported south to Europe and the Middle East. So the sea provided both their daily sustenance and their connection to international commerce.
That total reliance on the sea must have directly informed their social structure, which I find fascinating because it's rigid, but it's also surprisingly complex. Can you walk us through the 3 main social tiers that defined Norse society?
Sure. At the very top, you have the Jarls. These were the wealthy landowners, the chieftains, the local rulers, basically the nobility. Their power came from the land they owned, their skill in battle, and their ability to attract and keep a large following of loyal warriors.
And the foundation of the whole society, though, was this massive middle class.
That's right, the Karls. These were the free farmers, the craftsmen, the shipbuilders, and the traders. They owned their own land, they paid taxes to the Jarl, and, most importantly, they held legal rights. They were the absolute backbone, providing the food and the specialized labor that kept the entire society functioning.
And then at the very bottom, forming the engine of their entire economy, were the Thralls.
The slaves. And we have to be really clear about this. Norse society depended entirely on slave labor, perhaps even more so than any other contemporary European culture.
What kind of work did they do?
The most brutal, backbreaking work imaginable. Clearing land, construction, farming, rowing the longships, domestic service.
And they had no legal rights whatsoever.
I read that the legal status of a thrall was essentially the same as livestock, property.
Precisely. They could be bought, sold, traded, or killed at the owner's discretion with no legal consequence. And this system, it highlights a brutal truth about the emerging Viking economy. This right here connects directly back to the initial motive for raiding places like Lindisfarne.
That's the link I find most chilling. Silver and gold are easy to steal, but captured people represented long-term self-reproducing wealth. They did. Captured slaves represented immediate, fungible wealth. You could either put them to work right away to expand your own foreign power, or you could trade them for other goods you needed. If you were a young, aspiring chieftain with no land, a successful raid meant you came back with the ultimate capital asset: labor.
Is there a connection to the word Slav?
There's a strong potential etymological link. The word slave might derive from Slav, simply because during the Viking Age, vast numbers of people from the Slavic lands in Eastern Europe were captured and moved through these extensive Norse trading networks.
So, given that this society was so heavily reliant on the subjugation of one class, it raises a really interesting question. Why did they simultaneously develop such surprisingly advanced legal structures for the free classes?
That is the ultimate paradox of the Norse character, isn't it? Alongside this brutal system of thraldom, they had this deeply ingrained respect for law and governance, at least among the free. And the mechanism for this was the things.
The assemblies. Tell us about the things and what they achieved.
The things were regular assemblies held regionally, and they were open to all free men, both Jarls and Karls. And this wasn't just a place to, declare war or levy taxes. It was a complex legal institution.
So they were like a court and a parliament combined.
In a way, yes. They settled major disputes, like arguments over property or even blood feuds. They established new laws. And crucially, they provided a public forum where any free man could stand up and challenge the decisions or the authority of their local ruler.
So it wasn't a monarchy in the European sense where the king's word was automatically law. It was much more of a consultative, decentralized structure.
Exactly. It provided a powerful social pressure valve. And the most famous example, which really illustrates the longevity of this idea, is the Althing in Iceland.
Right.
When the Norse settlers codified their laws there in 930 AD, they established the Althing, which is often cited as the world's oldest parliament that is still in continuous existence today. It just speaks to this profound cultural respect for codified law and structured debate.
And within that legal framework, we also find another surprising deviation from the medieval norm, which is the legal status of women.
Yeah, when you compare the legal rights of Norse women to those in, say, contemporary Frankish or Anglo-Saxon society, the difference is just stark. Norse women possess significant legal autonomy. They could, and they often did, own property entirely in their own name. This was a very rare and powerful right for the time.
And this autonomy extended even to their most personal relationships.
Indeed, if a woman felt she was being mistreated, or if the marriage just wasn't working out, say the husband was repeatedly violent or failed to financially support the family, she had the explicit legal right to request a divorce.
And she didn't leave empty-handed.
No. She could reclaim her dowry upon separation. That ability to recover her family's wealth provided a crucial safety net and, frankly, a power base.
They were also the masters of the domestic economy, weren't they? The household managers.
They held the keys to the house, quite literally. The Norse woman was the manager of the household finances, and this was symbolized by the keys to the strongbox in the pantry, which she often wore at her waist. She controlled the distribution of all the resources within the home, making her a really formidable figure of authority.
This level of legal sophistication seems almost at odds with the popular image of the brute warrior culture. And speaking of warrior culture, we have to talk about the idea of the female warrior, the shield maiden. For decades, this was just dismissed as pure fantasy from the sagas.
It was. Most historians were very skeptical because the sagas, while they're invaluable sources, are often laced with poetry, exaggeration, and literal magic. The idea of a dedicated, high-status female warrior just didn't fit the accepted patriarchal narrative of early medieval Europe.
But that narrative had a massive hole blown through it in 2017.
A huge one. The key turning point was the DNA analysis that was conducted on the famous Birka grade in Sweden. This graze, designated BJ 581, was excavated way back in the late 19th century and was immediately recognized as the burial of an extremely high-status military leader.
What made it so obviously high status?
It was absolutely packed with martial symbols: a sword, a spear, an axe, arrows, 2 shields, and most tellingly, a full set of gaming pieces.
Like a strategy game.
Exactly, like a chess-like dame used for strategy, which suggested this person wasn't just a warrior, but a commander who understood tactics and deployment. And for over a century, it was just assumed, without question, to be a man.
And the DNA analysis.
Conclusively proved that the skeletal remains belonged to a biological female. Now, we have to be careful. We can't take one grave and say that all Norse women fought. But this single, undeniable piece of archaeological evidence confirms that for the Norse, the identity of a high-status warrior and commander was at least potentially available to women.
That's a huge shift in our historical understanding. So we have a society forged in this harsh land, structured by law and hierarchy, and driven by resource needs. But what truly gave the men, and perhaps the women, the terrifying willingness to cross oceans and face death head-on, that has to be their worldview, their mythology.
You absolutely cannot understand the military success of the Vikings without understanding their mythology.
Yeah.
It explains their fatalism, their quest for glory, and their apparent lack of fear.
So let's look at the cosmic geography first. Yggdrasil, the world tree.
Yggdrasil is the axis of their entire universe. It's a massive ash tree that connects and sustains the 9 worlds. And it's not just a physical structure, it's a living map of their whole existence.
And those 9 worlds are home to a whole host of different beings.
Right. You have Asgard, home of the Aesir, who are the primary gods like Odin and Thor. Then there's Vanaheim, home of the Vanir, who are gods associated more with fertility and prosperity, like Freya and Freyr. Then you have Midgard, which is our world, the world of humans.
And the dangerous places.
The very dangerous places. Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, who are these elemental forces of chaos. And then you have realms of pure element, Niflheim, the land of frozen mist, and Muspelheim, the land of fire. It creates this dynamic, dangerous, and ever-shifting stage for all of existence.
And ruling the Aesir is Odin, the Allfather. He's not a simple thunder god. He's incredibly complex, driven by this relentless quest for knowledge and a willingness to sacrifice for it.
Odin's character is fascinating because he prioritizes esoteric knowledge and long-term strategy over just sheer brute force. And the price he's willing to pay for that wisdom is enormous. We know of 2 specific extreme sacrifices he made just to obtain knowledge that would give him an edge in the cosmic battles ahead.
The first one being the sacrifice of his eye.
Yes, he travels to the roots of Yggdrasil to seek out Mimir's well, which is the source of all wisdom. Mimir demands a price that's almost too high for anyone else, one of Odin's eyes.
Yeah.
And Odin pays it without hesitation. He sacrifices a literal part of himself just for one drink. It really emphasizes that knowledge isn't inherited, it's gained through painful, calculated loss.
And the second sacrifice, according to the ancient poem Havamal, is the ultimate self-sacrifice.
To gain the secret knowledge of the runes. And we should be clear, the runes weren't just an alphabet, they were magical signs containing immense power. Odin willingly hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear. It's a sacrifice of himself to himself. This wasn't just a dramatic act, it gave him access to the hidden forces of the universe, which are essential tools for a god who is constantly seeking intelligence.
So he's fundamentally an intellectual and a strategist. He spends his time traveling the 9 worlds in disguise, appearing as this weary wanderer.
Exactly. Gathering intelligence, never revealing his true power until it's absolutely necessary. And he relies heavily on his 2 ravens, Hugin, which means thought, and Munin, memory.
His eyes and ears.
His global intelligence network. They fly out every day to Midgard and the other realms, and they return to whisper everything they saw and heard into Odin's ears. He is the ultimate spy master god.
And in stark contrast to Odin's complexity, you have the god that the people widely worshipped, Thor.
Thor is the relatable god. He's the people's champion, the god of strength, thunder, and storms, and the straightforward protector of humanity against the giants. He represents action and immediate protection, whereas Odin represents cunning and long-term planning.
And he wields the famous hammer, Mjolnir.
Mjolnir, forged by the dwarves, is an unparalleled weapon. It can level mountains, it can resurrect the dead, and its most crucial feature, it always returns to Thor's hand after being thrown. It represents reliable, overwhelming, protective power.
You know, I think the sources often surprise people because they show the Norse weren't always so somber. They actually had a great sense of humor about their gods.
They absolutely did, and the story of Thor and the giant Thrym is the best example of this kind of divine comedy. The giant Thrym steals Mjolnir and hides it deep underground, and he demands the goddess Freya as his wife in exchange for its return.
And Freya is not having it.
She flatly refuses, so the gods have to come up with a trick.
Which involves forcing Thor, the god of thunder, to dress up in women's clothing.
That's the whole joke. Thor is the epitome of masculinity and strength, yet he's persuaded to go to the wedding feast, dressed as Freya, veil and all. Loki, the trickster, goes along disguised as his handmaiden. It gets better, though. At the feast, Thor is so hungry he eats an entire ox and drinks 3 whole barrels of mead.
Which Thrym, the giant, finds a little suspicious for his delicate bride.
Very suspicious. And Loki has to constantly smooth things over, explaining that Freya hasn't eaten for 8 days out of sheer excitement for the wedding. Finally, when Thrym calls for Mjolnir to be brought out to sanctify the marriage, Thor just throws off the disguise, grabs his hammer, and proceeds to kill Thrym and every other giant in the hall.
It's glorious, it's funny, and it's deeply satisfying to a Norse audience.
A great divine cross-dressing vengeance story.
But then we have to swing back to the source of all the chaos in their mythology, Loki. He is not Thor's brother, as is often shown, but Odin's blood brother, which makes his eventual treachery even more devastating.
Loki is the embodiment of necessary chaos. He's a shapeshifter, he's morally ambiguous. Sometimes he helps the gods, but inevitably he leads them to disaster. His ultimate destructive act was causing the death of Baldur.
The god of light and beauty, the most beloved of all the gods.
Yes, and his death was prophesied to be the trigger for the end of the world. Baldur's mother, Frigg, had made every single living creature and object in the universe swear an oath never to harm him, which made him invincible. But Loki, driven by malice or maybe just his chaotic nature, found the one tiny exception that had been overlooked.
Mistletoe.
Mistletoe. It was deemed too young and harmless to bother swearing an oath. So Loki fashioned a dart from it and tricked the blind god Hodder into throwing it at Baldur, killing him instantly. And when the gods tried to rescue Baldur from the underworld, Hell, Loki made sure that effort failed too, solidifying the coming of Ragnarok.
And that treachery seals Loki's own fate until the very end.
His punishment is just terrible. He's captured and bound in a cave with chains made from the entrails of one of his own sons. A venomous serpent is positioned above his face, dripping poison onto him for eternity. His devoted wife, Sigyn, tries to catch the poison in a bowl, but every time she has to turn away to empty it, the poison drips. And his writhing in pain is what the Norse believed caused earthquakes. He just awaits Ragnarok in torment.
This intense focus on violence, sacrifice, and divine suffering brings us to the core cultural driver for the warrior, the afterlife. Because your destination was entirely dependent on how you died.
This is the psychological key to the Viking warrior's mindset. If you died peacefully in your bed of old age or sickness, what they called a straw death, you went to Hell. That's the realm, ruled by the goddess Hel, Loki's daughter. And Hel was depicted as this gray, cold, often unremarkable place.
Which, for a warrior, was the worst possible fate you could imagine.
It was a deeply dishonorable pedestrian end. The highest aspiration, the goal, was Valhalla. But Valhalla was reserved only for those who died heroically in combat, chosen from the battlefield by the Valkyries, who were Odin's fierce warrior maidens.
And what did life in Valhalla actually entail? It wasn't eternal rest in peace.
Far from it. These chosen warriors, the Einherjar, spent eternity preparing for the final battle. Every single day, they would put on their armor, march out to a great field, and fight each other, wounding and killing each other in these massive practice duels.
And then what?
Every evening, they'd be miraculously resurrected, completely healed, and would return to the Great Hall to feast lavishly.
Sustained by eternal meat and drink, I assume.
They feasted on the magical boar Sedrunir, who was killed and cooked each day, but was brought back to life each night for the next day's feast. They drank mead from the udder of the goat Heidrun. It was a perfect, endless cycle of fighting, dying, healing, and feasting, the ultimate warrior training camp for the ultimate inevitable war.
So dying violently in battle wasn't a tragedy at all. It was a promotion to the highest possible status.
Absolutely. You gained immortality and glory through your blood sacrifice. If you genuinely believe that death in battle is a reward, you fight with a terrifying abandon that a Christian soldier who's focused on saving his soul through penance simply could not match.
And that ultimate inevitable war is Ragnarok, the fate of the gods and the universe. The Norse worldview didn't allow for eternity.
No, their universe was cyclical, not eternal. Ragnarok literally means the doom of the gods. The signs of its coming are terrifying. 3 continuous terrible winters back to back, the Fimbulwinter, which results in total chaos, the collapse of societal order, and the breaking of all kinship bonds among men.
And that chaos unleashes Loki's monstrous children.
Yes. Fenrir the wolf breaks his magical chains and grows so massive he eventually swallows the sun. Jormungandr, the world serpent, rises from the ocean, encircling the globe and poisoning the air with his venomous breath. And Hel leads this massive army of the dishonored dead against the Aesir.
It sounds like total mutual annihilation.
It is absolute destruction. Odin, the Allfather, is swallowed whole by Fenrir. Thor finally kills Jormungandr, but is immediately killed himself by the serpent's venom after taking just 9 steps. The fire giant Surtur engulfs the entire world in flames, and the land sinks beneath the waves.
So if the world just ends, where is the motivation for renewal? Why fight for a cause that you know is doomed?
But this is the crucial insight that informs their fatalism. Ragnarok is not the end of everything. It is the end of the cycle. From the depths of the ocean, a new world rises, green and fertile. A few surviving gods emerge, including Baldur, who returns from Hel, and 2 human beings, Lif and Lifarosir, who shelter deep within the wood of Yggdrasil, emerge to repopulate the new earth.
So they fight because it's their honorable fate, and because they know that their sacrifice allows for the eventual rebirth of the world. That fatalism, coupled with the rewards of Valhalla, is a terrifying combination for their enemies.
It makes perfect sense why they would attack Lindisfarne without a moment's hesitation. The monastery was protected by a god they didn't respect, and if they died in the attempt, they achieved the highest glory. It was a complete win-win scenario for the Norse warrior.
So we have the people, we have the ships, and we have the belief system that makes them uniquely dangerous. Now, we have to ask the big question. Why 793 AD? Why did all these factors converge at that exact moment to unleash the Viking Age? What was the perfect storm?
It seems to be 4 key elements that just clicked into place almost simultaneously, right around the turn of the 9th century. If any one of them had been missing, the Viking Age might have been a much smaller, more delayed phenomenon.
Okay, let's start with the internal pressures at home. Number 1, population pressure and inheritance laws.
This is really the root cause. By the 700s, the population in Scandinavia had simply outgrown the land's extremely limited carrying capacity. Those tiny strips of arable land along the fjords were becoming crowded, but this population boom was made much worse by a cultural practice.
The inheritance laws, they created this whole class of desperate, high-status young men.
They absolutely did. The custom generally favored the eldest son inheriting the family farm and the chieftainship. This left all the younger sons, men of high birth, with their status but with no land, no wealth, and no means to support a following of their own.
So raiding wasn't just optional, it was a social necessity for these men to achieve status and build their own power base.
Exactly. They needed wealth, and maybe even more importantly, they needed reputation. The only path available to them was to gather a crew, get a ship, and go Viking, to seek their fortune abroad, either through trade or, more often, through plunder.
Okay, factor number 2, a target-rich environment. Medieval Europe was essentially a weak, unprotected vault at this point.
It was ripe for the picking. On the continent, the great Frankish Empire, created by Charlemagne, was starting to fracture under his less capable successors. And in Britain, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, they were constantly fighting each other. There was no unified military response.
And the defense mechanisms they did have were completely obsolete for this new threat.
They were geared entirely toward land-based threats, defending a border against a rival kingdom or putting down a local uprising. They had virtually no coordinated naval defense, no coastal warning system. They were just blindsided by attackers coming from the sea.
And as we already discussed, the monasteries were the literal gold vaults of the entire era.
Monasteries were seen by locals as these inviolable sanctuaries, the safest possible place to store your silver, your gold, your jewels, because of the threat of divine punishment. And this spiritual protection worked against Christian bandits. But for pagan Norsemen, the lack of armed guards and the immense accumulation of wealth just made them the most enticing targets imaginable.
Okay, factor number 3, technological superiority, which gave them the means to exploit this vulnerability. We're going to detail the longship in a moment, but its revolutionary design was absolutely key.
Without the longship, these raids would have been restricted to just the coasts of Norway and Denmark. This technology allowed them to strike deep inland, to cross open ocean, and to vanish before any kind of defense could be mounted.
And the final factor, number 4, climate.
Yeah, many historians point to the role of the medieval warm period, which roughly spans this era. A warmer climate likely meant slightly longer, more productive growing seasons back in Scandinavia, which contributed to that population pressure we talked about. But crucially, it also meant less sea ice and better, safer sailing conditions in the North Atlantic, making the exploration and raiding routes more reliably accessible.
So The economic pressure, the technological means, and the political weakness of the targets all arrived on Europe's doorstep at the same time. It was, as you said, almost inevitable.
And we shouldn't overlook the cultural driver behind it all. Going Viking was a verb, and it was a verb that carried inherent cultural value. Success brought the most valued non-material asset there was, reputation. A powerful reputation followed a man through his life and dictated how he was remembered after his death.
And that reputation allowed successful leaders to become ring givers.
This was the self-reinforcing economic cycle of power. A successful Jarl, having captured immense wealth, would be generous with it. He would share the silver rings, the bracelets, the treasures with his loyal followers. This act of generosity, the ring-giver economy, cemented loyalty, ensured warriors would follow him again next season, and attracted even more of those landless, ambitious men to his cause. Wealth translated directly into manpower and political power.
So the early strategy, which was established with Lindisfarne, was this pure hit-and-run model.
Precisely. Small-scale raids, often involving just 3 or 4 ships, maybe 100 to 200 warriors at most. The goal was maximum profit for minimum risk. Hit an isolated, rich target and just vanish.
And they learned very quickly, didn't they? They weren't tied to one single location.
Their diversification was immediate. Lindisfarne was 793. The very next year, 794, they hit the monastery at Jarrow. In 795, they struck the incredibly wealthy monastery of Iona in Scotland. They realized that by spreading their targets out, they made it impossible for local forces to defend the entire coastline. They were exploiting vulnerabilities almost instantly.
But none of this strategy, none of the expansion, and none of the eventual conquest happens without that one piece of medieval engineering marvel, the longship. We have to dedicate serious time to this. It is the single most important tool of the entire Viking Age.
The Viking longship is a testament to perfect form, meaning perfect function. It was flawlessly optimized for the specific unique needs of the Norse, this blend of exploration, trade, and swift coastal warfare, and it was completely unparalleled in the entire medieval world.
If you were to put a Viking longship next to a contemporary Frankish or Byzantine vessel, what immediately sets the Norse ship apart?
Its versatility and its incredible seaworthiness in the rough North Atlantic. Mediterranean ships were designed for relatively calm and closed seas. They were heavy, rigid, and had a deep keel. The longship was the exact opposite. Light, flexible, shallow-drafted, and capable of both crossing vast oceans and navigating tiny, shallow rivers.
How did they achieve that essential flexibility in the hull?
It was through their construction technique, which is known as clinker building or lapstrake. So instead of laying the hull planks edge to edge to create a smooth surface, the Viking shipbuilders overlapped the planks, kind of like siding on a house, and then riveted them together with iron. This created a hull that acted less like a rigid box and more like a flexible shell.
That flexibility seems a little counterintuitive for strength, especially against massive waves.
It's the genius of the design. When a rigid hull hits a massive North Atlantic wave, all that stress concentrates in one spot, and the hull can crack and fail. The clinker-built hull, because it could twist and flex with the energy of the wave, it just absorbed the shock. It literally rode with the waves, flexing up to several centimeters under duress, ensuring its survival in conditions that would have instantly destroyed other ships.
So it's a dynamic structure, and then there's the famous shallow draft and the keel.
Absolutely crucial for their tactics. The keel of a standard longship only extended about half a meter, maybe 50 centimeters, below the waterline. This made the vessels essentially flat-bottomed and incredibly stable, but it also allowed them to float in mere puddles of water.
And that's the strategic advantage that changed everything for Europe, isn't it?
It opened up the entire interior of Western Europe to them. Previously, major cities and monasteries, Paris up the Seine, London up the Thames, settlements deep along the Rhine, they all thought they were safe from coastal raiders. But now, the Vikings could sail 100 or 200 miles inland, rapidly disembark, raid, and then vanish before slow-moving, land-based defense could even organize a cavalry unit to respond.
This amphibious capability must have also made them excellent for trade. We hear stories of them hauling these massive ships overland.
That was the signature move of the Rus Vikings in the east. To connect the trade routes from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea and the Caspian, the routes they needed to reach Constantinople and Baghdad, they had to cross these massive stretches of land and navigate numerous river rapids. So they would just beach the ships, flip them onto log rollers, and literally haul them across the landscape using manpower, transforming the longship into an overland transport vehicle.
The logistics of that are just stunning, and they were fast, too.
Extremely fast. Under ideal conditions, with a strong following wind, A longship could reach speeds of 10 to 12 knots. But again, the longship's most important feature wasn't just its speed under sail, it was the dual power source.
They weren't dependent on the elements.
A single, square woolen sail powered them across the open ocean, maximizing speed and efficiency. But when they encountered dead calm, or more critically, when they needed to escape or press an attack against a headwind, they relied on oars. A typical warship, a drakkar, had between 30 and 60 oarsmen. This meant they could always maintain control, escape pursuit, and launch unexpected attacks, regardless of what the wind was doing.
Let's distinguish between the two primary types of vessels we see in the sources.
Right, so you have the drakkar, or the dragon ship, which was the dedicated warship. They were long, slender, often 25 to 30 meters, designed to maximize speed and troop transport for about 60 to 80 warriors. Then you have the nar.
The nar was the workhorse.
Yes. The nar was wider, deeper, and had a higher freeboard, a higher side. Its hull was designed to maximize cargo space, allowing it to carry not just trade goods but also livestock supplies and entire families for long colonization voyages. And crucially, the nar was also better optimized to sail closer to the wind than the drakkar, which made it far more practical for the long, unpredictable voyages needed to settle places like Iceland and Greenland.
So it's really the nar that made colonization possible. But even with the perfect ship, crossing the open North Atlantic without modern navigation just seems miraculous. How did they do it? No compass, no accurate charts.
It required generations of accumulated knowledge, passed down through oral tradition. They read the sea like a book. Navigation relied on the sun and the stars for sure, but also on much more subtle cues. The direction and the size of ocean swells, the color and temperature of the water, the salinity, and even the flight patterns of seabirds and the migration routes of whales.
And the famous sunstone theory plays into this too.
That's right. The most compelling theory suggests they used Iceland as spar, which is a type of calcite crystal. This crystal is naturally polarizing, so it could be used to locate the position of the sun even on overcast, foggy, or twilight days by polarizing the light. This sunstone would have allowed a navigator to maintain a reasonably accurate course even when the sun was completely hidden.
And the ultimate proof of the longship's viability is just the sheer distance they covered.
The settlement of Iceland beginning around 870 AD, then Greenland in 985 AD, and the eventual landing in Vinland, North America around the year 1000. The technology was entirely sound. In fact, in 1893, a meticulous replica of the famous Gokstad ship was sailed across the Atlantic to the Chicago World's Fair, and it reportedly handled severe North Atlantic storms beautifully, confirming the superior design.
So by the 830s, the Norse realized they had the perfect technology to exploit a weak Europe. The early raids rapidly escalated from these hit-and-run attacks to something far more aggressive and permanent.
The escalation was dramatic. By the 830s and 840s, the raids were no longer small, seasonal affairs. They were massive, organized fleets, and they began targeting major political and economic centers.
The most famous example of this being the attack on Paris in 845 AD.
A truly massive display of power. A fleet estimated at around 120 longships, potentially carrying thousands of warriors, sailed up the Seine River. The fleet was led by a chieftain named Ragnar, who many believed to be the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, was utterly helpless to stop this invasion of his capital.
And his solution to the problem became an even bigger problem for the rest of Europe: Danegeld.
Charles the Bald paid the Vikings 7,000 pounds of silver. That's over 3 metric tons of pure metal just to make them leave. This payment, which became known as Danegeld or Dane Gold, set a devastating precedent.
It was essentially free advertising for them.
Exactly. It signaled to every ambitious Jarl in Scandinavia that the rich, divided Frankish kingdom was weak, wealthy, and willing to pay enormous sums of money to avoid a battle. It became a cyclical, crippling tax imposed by the raiders on the Europeans.
And at the same time, the Vikings were shifting their strategy from merely looting to establishing a permanent presence.
That's the key strategic evolution. They realized they didn't have to sail all the way home every autumn. They started establishing long forts. These are fortified harbors or bases in Ireland and coastal Britain. These bases allowed them to repair their ships, store their plunder year-round, and launch year-round campaigns.
And one of those bases eventually evolved into a major European city.
Dublin. It was founded as a Norse long fort around 841 AD. This transition from raider to settler, from pirate to a permanent political force, is the most crucial part of this whole era.
All this crescendos in 865 AD with the landing of the Great Heathen army. This was not a raiding party. This was a full-blown invasion force.
The scale and the intent were just fundamentally different. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this force as being exponentially larger than any previous one, and they came not to plunder seasonally, but to conquer and occupy territory for good.
The motivation, at least according to the sagas, was highly personal and tied right back into that mythology we discussed.
The sagas claim the army was led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok figures, like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubi. They were seeking blood vengeance for the execution of their father, who was allegedly thrown into a pit of venomous snakes by King Alfred of Northumbria. This narrative provided a powerful, unifying story for the invasion.
Their first target after landing in East Anglia was the wealthy but politically fractured Kingdom of Northumbria.
Northumbria was a perfect example of Europe's weakness at the time. It was embroiled in a civil war between two rival claimants to the throne, King Alfred and King Osbert. The Vikings just marched north, captured the strategic city of York in 866, and used it as a secure base of operations.
The threat was so severe that Aela and Osbert finally put aside their differences to face the common enemy.
But it was a case of too little too late. They launched this desperate, unified attack on York in 867 AD. The Vikings, led by Ivar, completely routed the Anglo-Saxon forces. Both rival kings, Aela and Osbert, died in the battle. With their leadership just decapitated, Northumbria effectively ceased to exist as an independent kingdom.
That's terrifying efficiency. Less than 2 years to eliminate one of the 4 major English kingdoms.
And they didn't stop there. They secured their hold on York, spent a few years consolidating their power, and then turned their attention south to East Anglia,
where they encountered King Edmund.
King Edmund resisted fiercely, but was defeated and captured in 869 AD, and the Norse were keen to make an example of him. The tradition states that Edmund refused to renounce his Christian faith, so they tied him to a tree, used him as target practice, shooting him full of arrows, and then beheaded him. He became a powerful Christian martyr, but his death signaled the end of East Anglia as a political entity.
From there, the great heathen army moved into the largest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms at the time, Mercia.
Mercia tried everything.
Yeah.
They tried to fight, they tried paying Danegeld, but the momentum was just unstoppable. The Viking strategy had evolved past simple plunder. They now used captured horses to move quickly across the land, transforming into a mounted army capable of striking anywhere. By 874, the Mercian king Burgred just gave up and fled to Rome in despair, and the Vikings installed a puppet ruler, formally ending Mercian independence.
So, in just 9 years, 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, had completely fallen to Scandinavian conquest.
The Anglo-Saxons were right on the brink of total annihilation. The great Heathen army had established this massive territory of occupation that would eventually become known as the Danelaw. They were not leaving
only one last independent kingdom standing, Wessex, ruled by the young and very tenacious King Alfred. That truly is the definition of a cliffhanger.
It was the darkest hour for Anglo-Saxon Britain. The question hanging over all of Europe in the late 9th century was, how do you defeat an enemy who sees death as a reward and who can strike anywhere, anytime, with what seems like an inexhaustible supply of warriors?
The achievement of the Norsemen in that 100-year span from 793 to 900 AD is frankly astounding. Their expansion was simultaneously military, commercial, and colonial.
They were active on 3 massive fronts all at once. In the west, they were solidifying their political and urban presence in Ireland, with Dublin shifting from just a longford to a major commercial hub for the whole region.
And they were executing these massive colonial projects in the North Atlantic at the same time.
Absolutely. The colonization of Iceland began around 870 AD, and these weren't necessarily raiders. They were often prosperous Karls and Jarls who were fleeing the increasing consolidation of power by kings back in Norway. They were seeking free land and the autonomy of that all-thing legal structure. Iceland became a self-governing, legalistic republic.
And we can't forget the sheer scope of their activity in the East, the Rus Vikings.
This is so often overlooked in the Western narrative. The Rus established these vast trade routes across the great river systems of modern-day Russia and Ukraine. They moved furs, timber, honey, and slaves, connecting the Baltic Sea all the way to the sophisticated economies of the Byzantine Empire at Constantinople and the Islamic Caliphate at Baghdad.
That breadth of activity really confirms they weren't just simple brutes. They were succeeding because they were the ultimate adaptable pragmatists. They were willing to raid, to trade, to ally with anyone, and to settle permanently wherever the opportunity for wealth and status arose.
The sources confirm they were simultaneously destroying kingdoms in England and building sophisticated commercial empires in the East, linking all the major economic players of the entire era. The period from 793 to 900 AD really established the Norse as a permanent fixture in global history. They had the technology, the resources, and the fatalistic cultural imperative to dominate.
But as we leave the great heathen army marching south towards Wessex, the fight is not yet over. The stage is set for a massive collision. In the next part of this deep dive series, we have to look at the unified response, the comeback of Alfred the Great, the eventual establishment of a permanent, organized Danelaw, and the true extent of their exploration, the discovery of Vinland, North America.
That'll be fascinating, seeing how Christian Europe finally adapts to this pagan onslaught. But to close on the point we explored today, it really all hinges on belief.
Since the Norse worldview, embodied by Ragnarok, accepted that everything, their gods, their kings, the entire universe, was destined for a violent, predetermined end, did that deep-seated fatalism truly make their warriors inherently more effective? And was this belief system, which valued glory over survival, ultimately their greatest and deadliest weapon?
It certainly makes you wonder about the limits of courage when death itself is the ultimate reward.
Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive into the source material. Thank you for joining us.